Hi, everybody. I'm Carol Kaufman, founder of the Institute of Coaching, and I'm here with, back by popular demand, Richard Boyatzis, who is a distinguished professor at Case Western. He also has a book, and he'll talk about it a little bit today, called Helping People Change, Coaching with Compassion for Lifelong Learning and Growth. He also, you've probably heard of some of his books, Resonant Leadership, Primal Leadership, and whole bunches of other things. But Richard, I want to start off with a question that comes from an article you wrote for the Academy of Management, which happened to have won their award for Best Article of the Year or something. The title, for those of you interested in Googling it, is called Developing Sustainable Leaders Through Coaching and Compassion. And in it, Richard, you look at CEOs who are coaching with compassion. And one of the amazing results from that is that coaching is good for the coach. And what you don't know is I included that in part of my research at Mass General Hospital when we were looking at professional development for all of the internal medical residents. We also looked at, thanks to you, we also looked at the coaches who were coaching and found out that they had less burnout, particularly now. But can you talk about the article and
Sure.
what coaching does for the coach?
Back in that piece, which we first drafted in 2003, Professor Melvin Smith and Nancy Blaze, who was a physician working with us and a former MBA student, ended up making this argument that if you coach in a certain way, or if you help others, try to motivate them in a certain way, it actually sets off a set of very healthy things psychologically and physiologically for the recipient. But because of the emotional contagion effect, it does it for the provider of the help. So whether you're a CEO or an executive, a manager, a coach, or a parent, and in the new book, Helping People Change, Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Oosten and I make the point that whether you're a physician, nurse, parent, manager, coach, trainer, cleric, when you engage in the more effective, we've been able to show through all these longitudinal studies, more effective form of coaching that we label coaching with compassion, that it has a double effect, a positive effect. One, it helps the client renew, become open to new ideas and other people, including you as the helper. But because of the effect of emotional contagion, you're getting that juice in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second. It's deeply unconscious and very fast. So it's a great argument why it's important for people in helping roles, whether, again, it's coaches or physicians or managers, to use this kind of technique, to see a part of their job is to help other people grow. Because if they do it the right way, it actually helps them. Now, the other side of it is, as you and I were talking about many times, but just a few minutes ago, it's one of the reasons why it's very important for coaches to tend to themselves, to their own spiritual state and their own level of inspiration. Because if you're feeling rushed, hassled, angry, whatever, you're infecting your client with that.
So that's perfect. That leads to one of the questions that we had from Nancy Glenn, who is a leadership coach in Belgium and the UK. And she said that you had talked last time about that shorter forms of renewal and doing different things a day is sort of more effective than sort of a long-term one shot, which is a perfect way of thinking about how do we keep ourselves sort of refreshed and brains working. Can you talk about the research and tell us a little more about that?
And I'm glad for the opportunity to clarify it, because in the paper that I just found out is coming out in the March issue of Consulting Psychology Journal, we did a series of studies to validate a measure of personal sustainability. And what we were doing was asking people on a list of 17 activities or experiences, how many of them did you have last week? And for about how long? And to sum up the approximately number of minutes across the whole week. And then we did it for 16, and those were 17 activities or experiences that the medical literature say activate the sympathetic nervous system, the stress response. Then we pulled from the medical literature 16 experiences or activities that are shown to activate the parasympathetic or the renewal process. So we started with the medical literature and then the psychological literature and asked people to look at a typical week. A lot of stress inventories and a lot of measures look at extremes. Of course, in the Holmes-Rahe that's been around for 45 years, I think death of a spouse is probably the largest acute stressor that any human should ever have to suffer through. But a lot of the activities in these stress inventories are acute, and they're not what we typically live with, except during COVID. But so that was the issue. Now, what we were able to show in these multiple studies is that the amount of time during a week that you're in renewal activities minus the amount of time you're in stress activities is directly predictive in a multivariate statistical analysis structural equation model, as we used, of engagement, career satisfaction, sense of well-being, and was very strongly associated with higher empathy and better resilience, and negatively related to sense of distress, anxiety, and tension. And as we predicted, had about a 0 relationship to cognitive reasoning, because we thought that it should be independent of that. What we said, and we called that the frequency measure, which is, or intensity, how much of these two things are you doing? And what became very clear is that you can't wait till the weekend to have your renewal. And that's where I started to move from the actual data that we collected to what we read into it. And I hypothesize that it's much better, much healthier for people to have a larger number of briefer episodes in any given day of renewal. So I mean, it's absurd. You don't have an hour only an hour to renew. But if you had an hour, it's better to break it up into 4 15-minute episodes and scatter it throughout the day, because the very physiological concept is you're trying to interrupt all the ravages of annoying stress. Your cell phone drops a call, somebody's late to a meeting, all of these things that aren't big deals, but nonetheless affect your cognitive functioning and your emotional state. So the idea is briefer, I should say, more periodic doses is better. The one thing we did have data on, because we tested, is the variety. And Nancy had also asked about that. And this is the first time I've actually got data to support something that I've been claiming since the 70s when I was doing therapy with alcoholics and drug addicts, that if every time you try to renew or counterbalance the stress, or if you will, even bad habits, you go to the same thing, you're habituating something and you're just changing addiction. I mean, I remember, in the group therapy sessions I would have during the 70s, we'd sit there with folks who, had their AA chip. They'd been sober for 30 days or 30 months. And yet they were smoking in our several-hour therapy session that usually go through 2 packs of cigarettes, which at the time was allowable in every hospital and setting. But the idea is you really started to say, well, have you just substituted something bad for something else that was bad? And I even remember a few clients, patients at the time, who started exercising. Now, I enjoy being outside and this and that. I've never been an avid exerciser. I mean, hell, even the sport that I varsited in at MIT and in high school was riflery. The big control is finger, exercises. But anyway, but the idea was, I remember somebody who started exercising 6 hours a day. Now, you don't have to be my age to see that as a fanatic.
Yeah. So Richard, I'm going to pop you back over. First of all, what I think that's really fascinating is the connection between what you've also been saying for years, that what stresses your system the most are these small dings. And now what you're saying is what will help the system the most are these positive experiences. So I think that's very a lot of it seems very intuitively smart. And also something that we can all do, as you said, that as coaches and as leaders, we need to keep ourselves renewed, because that's our job. And this is a much better way to do it.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, for example, you and I watched and participated in some of the workshops at the IOC annual meeting a number of years ago, where people started saying, you know, if your client comes in and they're visibly distressed, it is a good time to spend the opening few minutes doing some breathing exercises, doing some, you know, meditation or whatever. And that speaks to the point you're making right now, is that that's a part of what we should be doing.
You know, it's interesting. I do a lot of work at Egon Zehnder, where we've trained about 350 consultants in coaching skills. And when I came into that organization, it was interesting. They begin every workshop and almost every meeting with a 1 or 2 minute mindfulness exercise. And then they start the work. But I'd love to hear about this, you know, so you hear a lot of people kind of carrying on about mirror neurons. And I have one client who's the head of a big brain organization. I said, mirror neurons, like true or quack? And he goes, true, but more complex. So Stephanie Wilson is asking us, you know, she's been reading it, and she'd love to learn more about the mirror neurons, where else she can learn about them.
Stephanie, what you need to study up on and learn about is technically called the default mode network, the DMN. Michael Rakel of Wash U first coined the expression. It's a lousy label because they were looking for what's happened to people's brains when they weren't doing a task. And sometimes it's called the task negative network. Tony Jack, my colleague and friend who does a lot of this neuroimaging study and research for a number of years, has some major studies that have been published. He just relabeled it the empathic network. That's the one that I was referring to. If I said anything about the mirror neuron network, it was in passing. And here's what the current research would clarify. The mirror neuron network is closely related to your motor neuron network, i.e. how you move your hands, head, body. The mirror neuron network is not the place where you experience empathy. That's the default mode or empathic network. The mirror neuron network is where you can mimic actions of others. So whether we're talking about rhesus monkeys or humans, the mirror neuron network helps you have some compatibility because you're mimicking. So if somebody yawns, you start to yawn. If somebody folds their arms, you fold their arms. And, you know, you and I know, Carol, from training as a therapist, one of the things you're taught to do is to mirror the patient or the client as a way to make them feel comfortable and draw them out. All of those things the mirror neurons help with. So I try to make a distinction that the mirror neurons are very important for social contagion, which is really much more actions, not feelings. But when you want to get to empathy or emotional contagion, it's the default mode network, what Tony calls the empathic networks, that's more key. And in fact, this was such an issue that Jacob Betti and Rizzolatti, the two neuroscientists that were the most original and prolific about the mirror neuron network, finally, there was a major conference back in 2011 that came out with a series of special issues in the neuroscience journals, in which they had a whole bunch of people saying, okay, mirror neurons, good or bad, mirror neurons, too little, too much, you know, all these things. And even as a part of, by 2011, it became clear that people had gotten way too carried away. It was like the right brain, left brain thing of the 90s, which was really a lot of psychobabble. Yes, there are right and left differences in every part of the brain, but is there a big difference between people who have a lot of activity in the right side versus the left side? No, because sometimes the right and left switch in terms of how they function, depending.
I didn't
Like
know that.
the amygdala. So parts of the amygdala that allow you to be more analytic versus more emotional or empathic are the opposite to the prefrontal cortex. So there are all sorts of things like that that go on. So the gross issue of right brain, left brain is just sloppy, but it hides something that's true, which is there are differences in the hemispheric dominance. A similar thing happened with the mirror neurons. I mean, people latched on to the early work and said, "Oh my God, that's the source of empathy," And I've heard all sorts of people with doctorates who read this stuff, but they don't do the research or stay current, say, "Well, the prefrontal cortex is the source of all empathy." Not so fast. The prefrontal cortex is also the source of the analytic network, which is kind of the anti-empathy network.
Yeah. Right.
So in this case, it's a clearer answer. The mirror neuron network helps behavioral mimicry and therefore social similarity of contagion. But to get to the emotional level and what you really want with empathy or empathic concern in a relationship is the default mode network.
Oh, that's great. And then some of the renewal things that you've been talking about are ways to kind of sort of, but just what you were saying earlier, if you can sort of create a more of a sense of calm, centeredness, compassion in yourself, your default network will somehow be connecting.
That's right.
To the others.
And the reason this is important is that if somebody has difficulty picking up these cues, these unconscious cues from other people, it's not because they have a dysfunction in their mirror neuron network. It's because they have a dysfunction in the default mode network, which is characteristic of people on the autism spectrum.
Oh, fascinating. So we have another question. It's a new topic, and this one is by Todd Snyder, and who's a fan of your work, by the way, but asks a really great question. So obviously in the work, it's, thinking of getting simplistic. It's like compassion coaching, good, compliance coaching, bad.
Right.
And so he says, how do you mix and integrate this compliance scorekeeping and the more sort of expansive? So love to hear that.
Todd, any of us who have raised children and have experienced dealing with teenagers knows that you can't always use coaching with compassion. And in fact, part of the whole theory, and as I described the results, is you need both. We need the NEA, we need the sympathetic nervous system, we need the analytic network in the brain. We need them to function. But we also need the other. And in this article that's about to come out, we called it Thrive and Survive, which is what we called it in the recent book. The two syndromes are both imperative. One helps us with survival issues, the other with thriving or flourishing. And if all you did was survive, you are plodding through life without much heart or soul. And if all you did was thrive, you're levitating. You're in the land of unicorns and rainbows and kittens. You're not in the real world. So when you're in a helping role, whether a formal coaching role or a manager or a parent or a physician, nurse, etc., there are times in which you move into the NEA and you do coaching for compliance. Our argument is, our research is showing that you want to lead with the coaching with compassion because that helps the person open up. And then you want, as the coach, to have the facility to bring a person back into the PEA periodically, because people will almost naturally gravitate toward the more defensive positions. And so one of the things I teach in my courses with the coaching with compassion assignments, where people have to go out and talk to people for an hour, and then I'm saying, you're not coaching them. Don't even tell them you coach. Say you're experimenting with ways to motivate people or inspire people. Is the emphasis on their technique is, what do they do to keep bringing people back? back to the
Oh,
PEA. So
yeah.
it's that moment that ends up being important, and the fact that you have that facility. But never have I said, as a matter of fact, you, Carol, you and I we had breakfast at one hotel in which you were commiserating why some people in the positive psychology movement have drummed me out of the core, because I admit there is a role for negative emotions and having to exercise self-control to change.
Mm-hmm.
You
Happily,
agree,
positive psychology caught up with you. In positive
right?
psychology 2.0, it's all about using negative emotion, but you were, as usual, about a decade
Thanks.
buddy.
So, so
Well,
the
in that case, I'll give myself some credit.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, you've been a champion of this reasonable approach. So, Todd, the issue is balance, but balance isn't always one-to-one because of the power of the negative and defensive hormones and systems. So, what our research and others have shown, Bob Fredrickson, John Gottman, and some others, that you really just want to think about oversampling in my language, the PEA. Because that's where a person reopens.
Mm-hmm.
So change, learning something it calls for a lot of self-control. The act of self-control activates the NEA and the sympathetic nervous system. It then has effects of what's called ego depletion when carried on too long. What I'm saying is our research is saying if you interrupt that periodically with, if you will, a dose of PEA, you keep people sustainable. And that's why I've been talking about it as sustained desired change.
You know what I love about what we're sort of stumbling across today is constantly talking about the rhythm, sort of,
Yes.
what is it that bothers
Yeah.
you? That being
Yeah.
these little dings, what you can do about it. And here in a coaching session, sort of like weaving back and forth, and how we can be sort of in tune to when does the client need a bit of infusion of the PEA, sort of stay with that. Then when they feel safe, energized, etc., you can do the negative feedback because they need to hear the challenge and raise the bar. And then, but most of all, what I find very compelling about your work is it is de-shaming. I think when you stay in the blind space, you bring up shame in people. And when you go to the compassion space and the connection space, you are connecting in de-shaming.
Yep.
And I want to just point out one thing. I just want to say we have people from all over the place. I've sort of lost track almost, but we've got Cape Town, Israel, we've got Palo, Dubai, Toronto, Florida, people from all over. And for me, it's wonderful to be part of helping more people know about your work. So we have one last question, which I thought was very poignant, by Claire Scott Miller, which is, what are ways to help people keep hope alive during setbacks? And particularly now with COVID. So what's your feeling in sharing about that?
Part of the ancient wisdom that most of us share in our spiritual practices is this too shall pass. So the question ends up being, how do you get people through that? Now, when you have annoying stress, it's a lot easier. When you have a single acute stressor, like the threat of COVID, it's easy. Not easy. It's easier. So if people were just afraid of getting COVID, there's a way to talk about, well, look, we're all going to have the vaccine. We'll get herd immunity, in 8 months to a year. Trying to look forward. Now, a lot of people criticize Donald Trump for falsely providing hope. I saw some of his promises not as likely, but as an attempt to garner some of that. Look, there will be a next phase. The problem is when you compounded the fear of COVID with the real loss of employment that a lot of people had, or the financial uncertainty, or the social isolation and the effect on mental health, now you started to get a pile-on. And it's very difficult to help people unravel all those levels. But what technique, Claire, we've spent time talking about this over the years. There's Claire and I work together at Case.
Oh,
One of the things is reminding people to talk about or ask them to talk about the bigger issues, the purpose in life. Last night, I was on my monthly call with a group of 15 of us who graduated from East Meadow High School together in 1964. And we talked about, how in June of 64, we thought our lives might be or would want to be versus that. And earlier, last night, the theme was, what are we looking forward to? And that's an example. It's a simple question. And for some people, it could be, as it was last night, I want to see how my grandchildren grow up to be adults. I am absolutely fascinated. Or I want to spend more time just doing fun things with my partner. And other cases, I was saying, I've got 5 or 6 phenomena that I've been puzzled about or studying for years that I would love to get a piece of research done on each one. But I'm a bit of a nerd. So, but the idea is to think about what's your purpose. And then to also think about, especially now as we start to open up and start to have interactions that just aren't on Zoom, what kind of person do I want to be next week? How do I want other people to experience me? And because we're actually in control of that, it stimulates a sense of hope. And that's the thing, that doing it individually is important. Doing it collectively is powerful. But the problem is, if you do it falsely, it doesn't feel trustable. Jerome Groopman, the noted oncologist at Harvard Medical School, where you work, wrote a book, The Anatomy of Hope, and he talked about thinking hope was always false promises as an oncologist, until he was in his 40s and a patient's family member took him to task on something. And all of a sudden he realized that there are aspects of hope that aren't false promises, but in fact a spiritual reawakening for people that are very important.
I have a client, Gail Gazelle, who's part of the Institute here, who, when she was a PAL doc, the patient turned to her and said, is there any hope? To which she said, hope for what? And how to really kind of be clear. But I also hear the same thing, that if you want to keep hope alive, if you can be doing more of this sort of rhythm of positive renewal, along with, reality-based hope, real, really experiencing reality versus denying it. And then also just really being as self-responsible as possible to help others around you kind of experience the PEA, and that will keep hope and optimism alive. So
and it has to do with hope, but it also has to do with caring relationships.
Absolutely. So we are almost at the end, and LinkedIn tends to just like cut you off mid-sentence. So before it does that, what I would love to do is first thank you. 2, we have more people who showed up, by the way, who said, hi, we're from Athens, Greece, New Delhi, Spain, Lebanon, Portugal. So this is wonderful. And so guys, there's a lot more of Richard at instituteofcoaching.org. You can put Richard Boyatzis in the search term and get a lot of his work. You can see when he has been at the Institute. He has given webinars, conferences, etc. If you're not a member, I believe we still have 1 month available where you can have a free fellowship for a month and you can find these things. So Richard, thank you tremendously.
Thank you, Carol,
for being part of us and sharing your wisdom with us.